I think this will be our final question, please.
Lauren Block-Blanchard with the Congressional Research Service. Michelle, I thought you did a great job of laying out sort of the conundrum U.S. policymakers face in Africa in trying to balance efforts to advance the democracy and governance agenda with the need to deal with powerful individuals in power. Today, the president and vice president of the new unity government of South Sudan wrote an op-ed in the New York Times calling on the United States and the UK and other donors to set aside the push for a hybrid court for South Sudan, saying that now was not the time for accountability, now was the time for truth. I'm curious, coming a week after the conviction of Hissène Habré for war crimes, which I think everybody sort of rightly praised as a real advance for justice on the continent. At the same time, we are seeing calls from leaders like South Sudan's to set aside justice. We see the dismissal of the trial against William Ruto, and before that, Uhuru Kenyatta. We see sort of a banding together of African leaders behind individuals like Omar Bashir. What are your thoughts on how the United States going forward in the near term? Of course, we're doing the long-term justice institution building on the continent, but in the near term, how do we deal with this challenge of a lack of coherence on accountability in some of these very difficult places where you have a lot of evidence to suggest that the lack of accountability is what is fueling these repeated conflicts? We're heading into elections in Kenya next year where we don't have accountability for the last post-election violence crisis. So interested in your thoughts.
So I feel like we could have a whole other day on that. It's a great question, and I think a really important one. And I think that I think you're absolutely right. There's evidence that would suggest an absence of accountability, absence of justice, hugely problematic for long-term stability, right? And for really everybody's interests in that respect. Equally, I think there are cases that people point to. There's certainly a debate to be made about sequencing, about accountability sort of being held over people's heads and getting them to dig in, right? And sort of redouble their efforts to ensure they never lose the protections that their seat of power provides them. I don't think that problem is a reason to sort of toss accountability out the window, but I do think that there's huge danger in losing the will and support of African civil society on this, and I think that's where the conversation needs to be, and that's where the lead has to be taken. And this is very difficult, of course, in societies, right, that suppress their civil society. But I'm speaking on a broader continental level, right? So this idea that the ICC is unfair and unjustly targets Africans, that calls for accountability and justice are Western-led and fundamentally biased, hugely dangerous in my view. And if we don't listen to what forces on the continent who should be the major drivers of demand for accountability and justice proposed by way of strategy, then I fear we end up undermining what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, the U.S. has to recognize in some ways the limits of its leverage. And, the much better interlocutor on this would be other African leaders, institutions, and kind of a transnational civil society. I think our interventions work best when there is a political will among African governments and African civil society to do that. Whether on any intervention, you can kind of expand out. But if that initial will on the continent is not there, it's very hard for the U.S. to kind of influence things. I think the idea of finding a critical mass of governments who are keen to find effective, acceptable models of accountability, to find transnational civil society networks that can kind of focus on this, advocate it with their own governments, with the African Union and so forth, is important. You know, we cannot kind of snap our fingers and make things happen. And as Michelle said, kind of risk losing partners and credibility elsewhere when we try to do that and kind of push things that many Africans are resisting.
Yeah, no, I'll just echo and agree because, you know, on the continent, they'll pay the most attention if it comes from African organizations. African civil society, particularly the media, is pretty active these days. I think we need to be able to nurture that and keep this on the front burner so that when the time is ripe, we'll be able to intervene effectively.
I think my fellow panelists have made the point well that this is a question that requires nuance. Every country, every political circumstance is different, a question of sequencing, but it also, I think, is a question, I would add this, a question of our own political will in cases where we have leverage. I see my good friend Amira there in the back there. In Liberia, for example, a country which I would argue is one of the African countries where we have the most leverage, and there's no crisis at the moment, et cetera. We have literally people who, you know, an incompetent prosecutor could convict of common murder because we have it on, because they were stupid enough to have it videotaped, and I think everyone knows what I'm referring to. And yet, I'm not aware of any demarche that we've even made that perhaps some of those, the impunity for some of those crimes, be looked at. And so I think in cases where we have the leverage, you know, we oftentimes not even bother to use it. So.
Thank you. Well, as we reach the end of this panel, I'd like to thank the participants for wonderful probing questions, and I'd like to ask that you join me in thanking these great panelists.